I'm here for our Changemaker Book Club. What we're trying to do with this book club is highlight books that are out talking about navigating change in our world, especially how we work, how we live. I'm incredibly happy to be here today with Henry Timms and Jeremy Heimans, the author of New Power. It's actually just released today, already #1 on social media, new books, which is awesome. And we're here at Story. Which is an incredible retail concept this month dedicated to how do you work and the future of work. And I'd love for Rachel Sheckman, who's the founder, the creative genius behind Story, to give us a sense of what's happening here, what's Story, and what's happening here.
Thank you. Well, thanks for coming, because I love that you're doing it here. So Story is a retail concept in New York City, and we reinvent an entire store every 3 to 8 weeks. We change the design, the merchandise. It's like a living magazine. So the products change. We do different events. We've done Love Story, New York Story, Design Story, about 40 different stories. So the current one is Workspace Story, and we teamed up with Aaron Dignan from the Ready and kind of really explored how people can work differently to optimize as much for productivity as happiness. And so there's 5 different rooms. Basically based on David Duane's concept of the eudaimonia machine, and each room has a different intention. And so there's coffee in a conference room, and people can even book workspace, and it's open till May 12th.
Great. So Story is one of my must-see places. If you're in New York City, if you make room for discovery, you need to make your way to Story. So it's a very New Power concept, I think.
Very, very good to be here.
So
thank you guys.
So
all right,
thanks
I'll
for
leave you
hosting
to
us.
it.
So Henry and Jeremy, you've been working on New Power for a while. It's a concept that actually first appeared in HBR a few years ago. We talk about power as basically how you have impact. How did you guys come to this concept? And maybe just let's right up front define, what do you mean by New Power? Is old power bad? What do we do about New Power?
It's great to be here. So I guess as kind of the essential skill of the 21st century, which is this ability to harness the energy of the connected crowd. And if you survey the world, take a step back and you think, okay, what's behind the kind of unexpected rises of Obama and Trump? What's behind the rise of businesses like Uber or Facebook? What's behind these amazing social movements like Me Too or Never Again? The theme amongst them all is this rise of new power, this ability to channel the energy of the crowd. So the book is really saying, what is new power all about? How do we all use it? And then, to your last point, how do we make this good for the world? Because one of our biggest concerns with this is the rise of new power has seen amazing opportunities, but we've seen the dark side rise pretty early.
So Jeremy, when you guys thought about this, I mean, obviously my brain goes right to the dichotomy, new power, old power. You guys specifically point out you're not trying to set up that kind of thinking, winners, losers. In fact, that's kind of an old power framework I have.
Well, that's right. So I think if there are some people who see the world in terms of winners and losers, right? Who see the world as a zero-sum game. But in many ways, there are people now increasingly who are growing up with these values that are much more about collaboration, right? And I mean, a good way to think of the difference between old and new power, to use a very topical example, is the difference between the way Harvey Weinstein exercised power for so long and the Me Too movement. So if you think about that, Weinstein's whole method of power is treating it like a currency, right? He hoarded that power, he spent it to reward his friends, to punish his enemies, to build up a huge hierarchy around himself that protected him over decades, of this alleged abuse and harassment. Now, contrast that to the way the Me Too movement works, and you see how power is operating very differently. Me Too looks like a current. No one can actually hoard that current, right? You can only try to channel it and shape its direction. And if we've seen the way the Me Too movement emerged, it basically surges around the world. It moves from geography to geography, it moves from industry to industry, and it has this enormous power, but it's a very different kind of power. And that's the essential difference between old power, which we think of as power as currency, and new power, which really, if you think of that metaphor of the current, that's how new power works.
I think it'd be interesting for you to share some of your personal stories about your experiences with new power. You both work in organizations. Henry, talk about Giving Tuesday, the 92nd Street Y, which is a very esteemed organization in New York. Very new power as I think about it, but talk about your experience with Giving Tuesday.
So the 92nd Street Y is even older than GE, I think, right? So we really think about and we had a really good 20th century, right? As an institution, we essentially exist to create community and build community. And the way we did that was people would come to our building, we'd create programs, and people would consume them. What changed is we can now think about influencing people very differently. So one of our campaigns was Giving Tuesday. So after Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we thought about how could you create Giving Tuesday, a movement that would take the spirit of community and philanthropy that we've cared about for 150 years, but then spread that around the world. And what was different about Giving Tuesday was we didn't brand it. It wasn't like the 92nd Street Y's Giving Tuesday. What was different is people turned it into other campaigns. So Giving Tuesday became Giving Shoes Day for Dress for Success to help women get back into the workplace. It became Giving Blue Day for University of Michigan, who raised $5 million last year. And even last year, Giving Tuesday is now in 100 countries. There were 2,000 events in Russia, which took place last year around Giving Tuesday. This idea, which began on the Upper East Side of New York, then spread around the world. And that's how we think about new power, right? It's not about the things you control and command. It's about the way you can forge these collaborations around the world.
And how did that change your organization? I mean, how they experienced new power. Can you share with us what you all learned collectively as an org?
I think one of the big challenges for a lot of people is a lot of us are inside old power institutions, right? Who are used to the kind of the managerialism and the bureaucracy and the sign-offs, and just that's how people find their way. And it can be a real challenge for people to then try and enter the new power world. What we saw worked.
Well, it wasn't new. It wasn't Giving Tuesday by the 92nd Street Y. So right there, how would it, you know who started it?
We had this conversation with our board, and actually they were terrific because we said to them, like, there were people who were saying, look, this is our thing. We've got to brand it, right? We've got to put our logo all over it, otherwise it won't succeed. And of course, what we said was, look, especially as a non-profit, our job isn't to be famous. It's not our job to get credit. Our job is to do good in the world. That's what we're trying to get done. And as soon as we started to shift that mindset, things began to open up. And of course, the irony is, Giving Tuesday grew so much bigger than anything else we were doing that the reflected credit was greater than it ever would have been if we tried to put ourselves at the front.
So interesting. So Jeremy, you created a company called Purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You've led your own new power movement and helped seed one in Australia and Get Up. Talk about a little bit what you learned there. And now you're working with companies and organizations trying to help them figure out new power and how do they apply it. Give us a bit of a sense of that step from how you learned and what you're telling companies you work with.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough in the days when we were just figuring out how to use the internet to mobilize people, to inspire them, to give them agency. I got very involved in that early period, which was in the mid 2000s, and back in Australia, where I originally am from, based in New York now. As a 20-something, I started this organization called Get Up. And Get Up was this social movement that we wanted to create that was sort of a way to reinvigorate people's sense of ownership in the democracy. People were sick of the political parties. They were just tired of politics, as they are all over the world. We wanted to give people a way to re-engage, and it just grew like wildfire, partly because we were using these new techniques, these new power techniques, to make it really easy for people to get involved, to give people the sort of feedback loops that made them feel involved.
Technique that you used?
Well, I mean, I think we just made politics fun again. There was an example where every year there would be an auction where big corporations would buy access at a charity auction to a politician. And there was a particular one where the opposition leader was auctioning off a surfing lesson. This is very Australian. And we got all the Get Up members to bid on this auction. And this particular politician was very hostile to refugees. So we got the Get Up members to bid for this opposition leader to have to give a surfing lesson to a refugee. And that story might seem simple, but it really captures people's imagination. It gives people a sense that they're back in control, that they can live their values in a way that is more lively, that is more energetic. So we learnt a lot from that, and then started Purpose almost 10 years ago now as kind of a home for these new ways to mobilize people around issues that really matter here in the US and around the world. And the journey has been fascinating because we realized that if we wanted to have the most impact, we would have to work not just with philanthropies and nonprofits, but we would also want to work with companies who are trying to live their values in a meaningful way. And what's been fascinating is seeing how relevant these first principles are of how you mobilize people are to the work that companies have to do as brands in the world that really now need to stand for something.
I mean, it has to be the way companies work. So a moment to remind you, this is our Changemaker Book Club. We'd love to hear from you if you have questions for Henry Timms and Barry Heimans, the authors of New Power. and how you harness new power. I'd love to dig in a little bit about business. We've gotten a couple of questions in advance from social media. Let me go to one of them. Someone asked, how can you adapt a new power strategy in your own career? So let's make this very personal. Especially when you work at a more traditional, hierarchical organization. I'm sure neither of you have heard that question before, but it's an important one. How do you adopt some of these new power methods if you're working in a traditional company?
Well, one of the concepts we talk about in the book is this idea of the founder feeling, right? So if you think about what's really going to animate people today, it was struck by some research we came across when we were researching the book, which was that this new generation below the millennials, were asked to name themselves. And they chose the name in this huge poll, the founder generation. And that's because everybody now, even people working in big organizations and companies, they want to feel like founders, right? They want to have more agency over what they're doing. They want to be able to do a whole variety of things, not necessarily just stay in their lanes. They want to feel like they can build something. And so I think that when companies are thinking about how to build around this, they have to think about how they too can create the founder feeling in the daily lived experience of the people who work there.
Henry, any thoughts you have, or
Yeah,
advice you're giving your friends?
Well, I think the trick is not to be superficial about it. Like, I think one of the dangers, right, with this work is you kind of, okay, the world's changing, I better finally master Twitter, right? Or I better work out what Snapchat really is. And actually, that just doesn't go far enough. The real question for institutions and companies is, are you making structural changes that allow people to participate in more meaningful ways? And like one thing, you know, in your work, Beth, is like the work that you did from my perspective, which was kind of most interesting, was the work that actually changed structures at GE, didn't just change symbols, right? It's very easy for companies now to change the symbols, which is we're open source, right? I want to engage, I'm starting a movement. Like, we hear this all the time from companies, but when you peel that back, the structures are still the old power structures they've always had. So the diagnosis, I think, for corporate leaders is, are you making those structural shifts? And if you're not, it's typically window dressing.
Yeah, there were a couple of thoughts to that point in the book that you talk about. You say, in terms of how do you build a new power team, how do you take some of these structures, you talk about be a bridge builder, not a beard, which I thought was interesting. And I feel like in my work at GE, people like me, we were the bridge builders. We had to build the bridge from what we saw on the outside and make it relevant inside. But people have to cross that bridge themselves. They can't be told what to do necessarily. You also talk about be a solution seeker, not a problem seeker. I'd love you to expand on those a little bit more.
So we were trying to think about one of the, I think, kind of lazy thoughts that has been very popular but is proven to be untrue, is this idea that somehow everything needs to be disrupted, right? Everyone's going to disrupt everything and it's going to be terrific and everything will hire...
Anxiety.
Right, we'll hire some 23-year-old who used to work at Twitter and they'll come in and disrupt us and everything will be fine. And actually, the thing which is really shifting change is when people are being a bit more thoughtful about organizational transformation. So we outline these kind of three characters that we see succeeding. The first is this idea of the shapeshifter, right? Which is people who have a lot of old power credibility, who help to turn an organization into the new power world through their example, right? I think you're a good example of that. You also think about the kind of the bridge, which is the person who is really building these structural routes to participate, not just the digital beard, which is the person who appears at an annual retreat and talks about the blockchain, right?
And every company sees through that.
Although those people keep getting hired,
they do
right?
keep
Time and again, you see these people who kind of get hidden in a corner with a big fancy speech once in a while, and they have no meaningful leadership over the institution. They aren't in the top meetings. They don't have a line into the CEO. And then the last thing actually was drawn for some research by a friend of ours, Hila Lifshif Asaf at NYU, and she went into NASA who were trying to deal with some ideas around open innovation. And she said, we see two groups of people emerging at NASA. There are the problem solvers, which is the people who think I can solve all these problems myself because of my own brilliant genius. And there are the solution seekers. And the solution seekers reach out to the new power world and they find ways to engage the crowd. And so if you're thinking about building a team, you think about, okay, who's my solution seeker? Who is my bridge builder? And who is my shapeshifter? And those are the three parts.
Those are great, very practical. Give us some examples of some great role models of new power. You have quite a few examples in the book, but pick a couple of your favorites.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, a kind of counterintuitive one is Pope Francis.
Yeah, that
so,
was a good, interesting
here is a person who is, runs the oldest of old power institutions, right? But he's a great example of what Henry described earlier as this shapeshifter, right? So, no one can doubt his infallible credibility within that institution. He was literally elected by this secretive conclave of cardinals, and yet he came in there and everything he did in his early steps as the Pope was about pushing power down away from that elite group of cardinals toward the laity. So, you know, that first move when he becomes Pope, where he says, I don't want the fancy papal robes. I'm just going to take these plain white robes, right? I don't want this Pope-mobile, which elevates me and my prestige. I'm going to get a tinny little Ford Focus and be driven around in that. So he made all of these symbolic gestures, but even more importantly, the Pope did think about structure. So he did this extraordinary thing by the standards of the Catholic Church. He actually sent a survey around to every single Catholic in the world via those local churches, where for the first time in the history of the Catholic Church, he just asked people, what do you think? Right? Which is really the opposite of the usual power relationship, right?
So feedback I'm taking away from that is a critical element in new power.
That's absolutely right. And a willingness then to really break up power structures and to push that power down and out. And in order to do that, he had to reduce the power of those cardinals and increase the power of the local priest and the local parishioner.
Do you have a favorite new power example?
I think we've really admired Black Lives Matter, in particular, in terms of a leadership example, because of their extraordinary achievement writ large, but also the work they have done to think very intentionally about what kind of leadership we need in the world, which is, you know, the three founders were very careful to resist the idea of becoming the superstars of the movement. They were always trying to make the whole movement more powerful as it grew and as it spread. I think they're a terrific example of new power at its best.
And I think this is one of the big dynamics of our day, which is as we see these new decentralized movements emerge, and even we see this in the corporate world, we have to start rethinking our idea of a leader. Our human tendency is to try to embody organizations or movements into one person. Right.
So then build on that, Jeremy. How would you define a new power leader? What would be, if you were hiring for your team, a board?
Absolutely.
What would be your job description?
The fundamental characteristic of a new power leader is one who's both good at and seeks to make her or his crowd stronger. In other words, the focus is going to be on, are you making more people more powerful through your leadership? And that's very different to the kind of optics-driven approach, where we think, do I look like a guy who makes people more powerful? It's very different to whether you're actually doing that. So I think that's the key quality. And then, you know, to push that even further, some of that requires thinking, I'm going to not act like a traditional leader at all. So if you think of Black Lives Matter, they call that movement leaderful. And what that means is that they don't want individual leaders to be taking up the space with formal authority. What they want to do is create a whole network of leaders who can take the spirit of the movement and make it their own. That doesn't mean no structure, but it does mean a version of leadership that is much less about everything laddering up to the top of a particular pyramid.
So to do that, you must have to be pretty clear on communication. You have to have a set of values. I mean, what are some of the elements, Henry, that you would recommend for someone?
I think you also have to have your ego in check, right? Which is, I think, a lot of people look. You know, power corrupts, right? And we all understand that, right? And it takes a different type of leader to resist the temptation of letting it become all about you, right? And I think that's one of the big goals of a new power leader. Although it's a very interesting one. We were having a conversation with Susan Cain's group, who writes all about, you know, the quiet and introverts. One of the interesting things that came out of that conversation is this idea that actually perhaps more introverted people actually have some natural new power leadership skills, because they're able to be much more collaborative. They're able to see their network succeed and not think,
they're uncomfortable with it being about them.
Where's my logo, right? Why am I not on the front of the magazine? So I think there's great hope actually in us seeing a kind of leadership which is less about the kind of heroic CEO figure and more about the people who are pushing power to their networks. And that's what the book's really about.
So we're talking new power. Henry Timms, Jeremy Heimans, we're live taking your questions, so feel free to send us. To that point, the discussion we've had, one of the questions that came in to me earlier was this. It says the same factors that make new power participatory, collaborative, and decentralized are very positive. They also can create this polarized, reactionary movement. What advice do you have for business leaders, anyone who's leading government, civic, and us as individual citizens to make power work for the many and bring us closer together, not divide us? I think everywhere you go, people are asking this question.
That's right. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is this is part of why we wrote this book. It was really important to us that these ideas get into the right hands. Because I think the story of our age, to the point of this question, is the climate deniers are in many ways more effective at spreading their message than the climate scientists. The doctors can be outrun by the anti-vaxxers, right? And part of that is because if you're unrestrained by truth or by facts, then you've got free range to make up whatever you want. And as we know, actually, false rumors tend to spread faster than truth and facts. So that's a reality of our age. And what that means is it compels all of us to get really good at these new power tools, at learning how to spread our ideas more effectively. I think if we can do that, if we can train up the people who are trying to bring people together rather than tear people apart, and we can give them these new power skills, I think we can get a lot further along. But that requires a mindset shift, right? So if you're a scientist, understandably, you've been steeped in the idea that what matters is only that I come to the truth and I arrive at the truth. But in a world where ideas spread as fast and frankly as strongly as they do now, it's not enough just to have the truth on your side. And so part of the mindset shift is helping people who are fighting the good fight to understand how important it is that they don't just get it right, but that they spread their ideas sideways.
Another question that came in is, are there any business sectors that so far have been untouched by new power, and what are they, and what would you recommend they do to think about new power?
I don't think anyone's untouched, although there are some who've been pretty resistant. We one of the things we found in the book, there was a spy agency. Right, so you think about the old power world. It's hard to think of something more old power than being a spy agency, right? It's about you've got all the information, you're holding it up, you've got all the power, you've got all the control, and even spy agencies are basically thinking to themselves, okay, I've got this world now where I have to engage with this crowd because there's more intelligence being created out in the world by all of us with our phones than they ever used to have by the satellites they could control going over the world, right? So there's this very different power dynamic that even people in the oldest of old power institutions are beginning to grapple with what new power looks like. I think, to Jeremy's point, the question is now how fast they move. Because the great danger is some of those organizations in the philanthropy sector, in the civic sector, in the corporate sector, who we need to be at the forefront of leading change, are actually on the back foot when it comes to new power. Because they did so well in the old power world that they aren't prepared to challenge themselves to make this shift.
So let's, in the time we have left, I'd love to sort of bring it down from a business perspective, for people in business. In fact, you have a whole section of the book that's about applying new power to business. So we did a poll in advance, and one of the topics people wanted to hear about is how do you make ideas spread? So if you're working in a company, you don't just have to be in the marketing department, you want to launch a new product. Give our viewers 2 or 3 tips in a new power way of how do you make an idea spread?
I think the most important principle is you've got to make that idea something people can grab hold of and participate in, right? So we have this very simple framework in the book that a good idea these days needs to be actionable. So what that means is it's not enough just to say, here's the soundbite, here's the idea, isn't that great? You've got to embed an action in it, right? The second principle is it has to be connected. So there has to be some mechanism within the idea that makes it spread, that makes people feel like they're part of something bigger. And thirdly, it has to be extensible. And what we mean by that is, if you come up with this perfect idea and you say, isn't my idea great, but there's nothing you can do to it, all you can do is consume it, people won't really share it. But if you construct an idea like Giving Tuesday, which people could make their own because no one owned it, and they changed it. In some cases it was Giving Tuesday. People adapted it to whatever the circumstance was that they were in. It spreads much faster.
So you called that ACE in the book. So
That's
actionable,
right.
connected, and expand and extensible.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's so ACE is a good way to think about it. Let's talk about leading in business. Transparency comes up a lot in new power. I'm thinking if you're leading a team, you're leading a company, how transparent do you want to be? My competitors might see my information. How do you deal with the transparency imperative and some of the other governance issues that organizations need to have?
I think it's a great question. And I think, again, one of our prescription here has never been a race to extremes, right? You go from complete confidentiality to complete transparency, right? The whole point of this world is to say, do we understand new power and can we blend it in the right ways? Now, clearly, there are demands on all companies now for greater transparency, not least from new leaders joining the institution who expect to know everyone's salary and know all the kind of what were essentially the company secrets. They expect to be in on those conversations now. So I think the role of the leader is not to kind of try and clamp down and reject these different expectations, but work out the right blend for an institution. The one thing I'd add on transparency in particular is what we're seeing again and again with corporations now is this idea that they get occupied by these forces they weren't ready for, right? So you see this all the time now with companies who just get these crowds of people who take issue with them or what they stand for, and they're getting bowled over again and again and again. And actually one of the key corporate skills now, the group of people who previously were kind of coming into the fold armed with their press release, right, actually now have to work out how you can channel the energy of that crowd. So look at Dick's Sporting Goods in the recent gun control debate, right? They ended up in a situation which they could have got very much the wrong side of an issue. They ended up generating a great deal of goodwill because they were prepared to channel the energy of the crowd. So any corporation out there is thinking about these issues now, not just at CEO level, but actually throughout the institution. If you can get new power right, you can create a lot of value.
But that requires a bit more courage and a bit more boldness. So I think a lot of corporate leaders were trained for decades to think, stay out of controversy. Keep your head down, right? But actually, that's not perhaps the right strategy in a lot of contexts now, because the employees of these companies are demanding values-driven leadership, so that when values seem like they're on the line, right? For example, the Muslim ban moment, which affected a lot of companies in the early days of the Trump administration, people were demanding. The Google employees were literally out at the Googleplex, beckoning the leadership of Google to join them in that protest outside. So one piece is this demand for purpose-driven, values-based leadership means you actually probably need to be bolder, even if that means you don't please everybody.
Yeah.
A percentage of people are going to disagree with you. If you have values on your side and you have intensity on your side, you have passion, that's in many ways now more important than being bland and not controversial. That's a very different dynamic to 10 years ago.
I was speaking to this guy who runs a big, very successful new media company, and he was saying our whole business used to be about scale, right? How many people can you get to? And what we've realized now is our whole business is about intensity, which is actually, it's not about can we get lots of people to think we're okay, it's about getting the right group of people to think we're terrific. And actually that's the trade for corp.
Intensity is a new power.
Intensity is a new favorability, basically, right? That actually, if you've got that intensity around your brand or your company, you're going to get further than the favorability you used to hope for, even if it means losing some people at the margins. And that's a tough trade for people who were so used to being off the sidelines of this debate.
So we're here at Story in Chelsea in New York City, and this story is about the future of work. I'd love you to lay out some things people can think about. How does new power shape the future of work? And specifically talk about the Buurtzorg, which is a nursing collaborative, and I think a really interesting example of where work's going.
So one of the great examples, you think about nursing as kind of one of the great old power professions, right? Especially nurses are kind of the bottom of the totem pole, very tough jobs, a lot of dissatisfaction in those jobs too. And the group of nurses in the Netherlands said, we're going to do nursing differently. We're not going to do old power nursing, we're going to create a new model for nursing. So they said, we're going to create teams of 10 nurses who can go out and they can create their own practices. They can decide where to spend the money, they can decide what's paint on the walls, they can create their own spaces, like Story, right? They can create their own space to reflect their own practices. They can make all the decisions. And our job is not to administer them and not to overmanage them. And what's been so interesting is now it's the biggest community care network in the Netherlands is Buurtzorg. It's run by these kind of founding teams of 10 nurses. They have a central office of like 50 people running a network of 15,000 nurses. They're getting better health outcomes. And you see these nurses who are doing things like creating radio stations or developing kind of community health days. All of the agency that they've pushed down into their institution and out into the world is making society healthier.
Asking people in the neighborhood to go look on a neighbor and sort of help extend the nursing, and I mean,
instead of adding to their own hours.
And they to your point, they grabbed agencies, so they were empowered. They have very fluid job descriptions. It strikes me. What else is this sort of?
They also have something very fun, which is nurse-friendly software. It's such a great phrase, right? Nurse-friendly software. Their whole network of experts is connected, so it means that if you're a nurse and you have a question about Alzheimer's, you can find 3 other nurses who've been doing this for 25 years who are going to help you solve that problem. And again, that's not going through a hierarchy, it's going sideways through the network, and that's the key learning.
But it's not anarchy, it's not holacracy.
Right.
We talk about
you talk about holacracy being very old, very sort of rigid, right?
Because to your point, Beth, these nurses have a lot of flexibility about how to define their own structure. Basically, the brief is, you're 10 people, figure it out. Right, come to your own processes and decision making. Whereas holacracy, which is, as we know, is very much in fashion with companies like Zappos and Medium and others in Silicon Valley, is incredibly doctrinal. Right? It's got, it's got
It
a
was too
rule
rigid
book.
for us at GE.
It was
Right, yeah, right.
And
That's
it's
right.
extraordinarily rigid, actually brings more process to the table.
Yeah.
So it essentially replaces hierarchy with
Rules and
with
more
the
rules.
oppression of process. And it treats people not like humans, but like machines, right? You can code for a machine, and that code can be, as long as your arm, but human beings don't work that way. And so what we need is not kind of rigidity about this stuff. We need very human-centered new power approaches, where the litmus test is, how does it make the person feel? When we met one of these nurses in the Netherlands, Madelon, you've never met a person with who seems happier about their job. I really wanted to.
Joyous reading
Yeah,
about
right.
the nursing collaborative.
I just wanted to go and
Yeah.
move to Holland and
Yeah, me
become a
too.
Dutch nurse.
Well, I felt like it was a good model for a lot of works, which is really we go much more from being managers and teams to being collaborators at
That's
every
right.
level. So this is New Power, released today. Henry Timms, Jeremy Heimans, they have been at work at this for a while. It's a great concept already, #1 on social media. It's been out, a couple of hours?
Couple of hours, early
Yeah.
days.
So
Few
I want to
hours.
wrap up again. This is people who mostly watching this who work in some form or fashion, which is most of us. So give us a couple of things. You're watching this. You're going to buy the book. What are 1 or 2 things that you would advise people to do to change how they work differently, to be a more new power approach to work?
Well, let me flip that a little bit and give some advice for folks who are steeped in these new power tools. So you think about particularly younger people, but most of us now, we're all hooked on the feedback loops of Instagram. If you think about how different it is to work in a big 20th century company or organization where you might get an annual performance review, compared to the feedback you're constantly getting on Instagram or on Facebook, aren't you fantastic? And I think one of the things that we say is it's important to distinguish between the two. So from
Really
the
great
perspective of an employee, right, it's important to realize that you just won't get the same level of constant affirmation and feedback that you can get so beautifully delivered via these online platforms. But conversely, it's also really important for companies to realize that they have to adapt the way they give feedback to the 21st century worker. Because the 21st century worker has much higher expectations about that experience, about the quality and regularity of that feedback. So we're really interested in sort of how you bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And I think there are some really interesting ways that you can do that.
So you might urge people who are watching this to think how they get their feedback.
Yep.
Are they drilling in enough? Are they asking for tough feedback as well as just the "Hey, I like you" kind
Yeah,
of feedback?
precisely.
And if organizations aren't having systems for faster, more regular feedback, they're going to be behind.
Exactly. So it's got to go both ways.
Yeah. Henry, how about you? What would be something you'd recommend that people do in a new power way?
So I think find the shapeshifters inside your organization. Find the people who have high old power credibility who will actually help lead the way. Because time and again, we keep meeting people around this work who are so excited about it and understand it and want to do it and have great examples. And they look up to their bosses and they're just people who are just so resolutely stuck on the old power world. The
Or
trick
they need help. They can't do it all themselves.
and then they need help shifting their identity.
Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting about all this work, is it's not about technology, it's about identity. So find those shapeshifters, those people who have high old power credibility, who you can see actually want to make this leap and become their mentors. Start working with them to help shift them, because if they start shifting, you'll start shifting organizational culture. I think that's a good practical tip.
So great talking to you both. Big
Thank you.
fans.
Well, vice
Thank you.
versa.
New
Huge
Power.
fans of you.
Henry, Jeremy, out today. Feedback, shapeshift, and a lot more here. Find out why the Pope and Lady Gaga are new power forces.
And Beth, actually.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time. Changemaker Book Club.